Welcome to my video on strategies for synthesis. Let's first take a look at what is synthesis. Synthesis is a mashup of ideas and perspectives to establish connections between sources as a way for you to create inferences from your sources and develop your own ideas. One way to think about your sources is to imagine each one as an author sitting around a table discussing and debating ideas. Let's eavesdrop on this discussion.
If you could go back in time and change one moment in history, what would you do? Is anybody not going to say Hitler?
Well, there's been the conversation, right? If you went back, would you kill baby Hitler? Because you're still technically killing a baby, and also you don't have the knowledge if someone else would be in his position, and would they be far worse?
That's the thing.
You never know.
Although it would be hard to be worse than Hitler.
There have been a lot of people who are worse than Hitler.
I just
Pol
think
Pot, I would say Stalin.
where we are now as a society, as a people, as Earthlings, I don't know. We're in a place where we've learned everything from. Well, we share this Earth. We're Earthlings. We've learned everything we've learned. Everything we are now is due to the things that have happened in our.
I'm Meg Turney.
I'm Philip DeFranco.
I'm Steve Zaragoza.
The first thing you want to do is summarize, paraphrase, and or quote these three sources. Phil first asks, if you killed baby Hitler, would there be someone worse? He then states that it would be hard to be worse than Hitler. Meg disagrees with Phil, stating that there are a lot of people who have been worse than Hitler. Steve adds that who we are today is based on our cumulative prior experiences. Alright, so that's the first step to synthesizing. You read your sources and summarize what they have to say. Now we're not quite synthesizing yet, that's summarizing. When novice writers are asked to do a synthesis, they usually stop at the summarization stage. The next step is to join that conversation. Imagine that you were the fourth person at that table. What are the connections between what Phil, Meg, and Steve had to say? How would you categorize their responses? What do you think? Would you agree, disagree, or expand upon their viewpoints? Engaging with those questions after you summarize is the beginning of synthesis. So let's take a look at a technique made famous by Gerald Graff and Kathy Birkenstein called They Say, I Say. They provide usual sentence frames for switching back and forth between the ideas of your sources and your perspectives and your sources. In MLA format, when you first introduce your source, you need to mention the author's full name and the title of the source. In MLA format, if you know the author's credentials, include that as a way of establishing that source's authority and credibility. Also, if the author's name is not mentioned in the source, just the author's ideas, then include the author's last name and the page number. Include the page number even if you summarized or paraphrased. When you want to disagree or agree with an author, then use sentences like, although I agree with Dorado up to a point, I cannot accept his overall conclusion that, and then continue with your argument. You could follow the same structure for agreeing. Although I disagree with Silva on blank and blank, I agree with her conclusion that. Each one of these sentence frames can be imitated in your own writing. This isn't considered plagiarism. These are simple tools and resources that academics and writers use to engage in discussion and debate. Here's a list of verbs that you could use for your own writing. Now, it's important to know the author's purpose and stance in his or her article or book because that'll determine which verb to use. For a copy of this list, feel free to visit the website or simply pause the video and take a screenshot of the list. In this last section, these are recommendations for transitioning from a quote to your own perspective or argument. Let's say you have a quote. In the sentence that follows, you can start with, basically, Silva is saying, by summarizing the author's quote, you're cueing the reader that you now have the driver's wheel. The same thing happens when you follow a quote with, in other words, or any of these other options that sum up the quote. Once you sum it up, then you can follow with key words like to agree, disagree, or expand the author's viewpoints. Now, in APA format, there are some important differences based on the value system of the social sciences and sciences. First, you should notice that only the last name is mentioned. The sciences attempts to be neutral in terms of gender. Also, the year of publication is included. In the sciences, how recent a study is critical to establish its relevance and significance. Whereas in MLA format, which is used in the humanities, it doesn't matter that Shakespeare is hundreds of years old. His work is as important, if not more important, than a contemporary writer. As you see in the following examples, everything looks quite similar to MLA sentences, except for the names and publication dates. feel free to pause and screenshot any of these next frames for your notes. In this last section, one thing I want to point out is that APA format, you need to include the letter P and a period when including the page number for quotes. Now let's take a look at a sample paragraph in which the student writer engages in a dialogue with the source and agrees with his viewpoint. In blue is the source's perspective, in red is the student's perspective. You should recognize some of the sentence frames I previously mentioned. To address the question, is Facebook making us lonely? Stephen Marshy, the author of an Atlantic article with the same question for the title, considers several explanations for the correlation between social media use and loneliness. Marshy claims that people have become more connected than any other generation due to social media, yet feel more lonelier than ever. Marshy captures this contradiction in his opening example about Yvette Vickers, a former Playboy playmate and a B-movie star, who lay dead in her apartment for a year before found. She only had internet friends. Marshy later asks, is Facebook part of the separating or part of the congregating? Is it a huddling together for warmth or a shuffling away in pain? Marshy never answers his own question, but he suggests that Facebook could be alienating people from meaningful face-to-face social relationships, the kind of relationships that overlook the health and well-being of those in the relationship. Here's the same paragraph as before, but in this paragraph, the student writer expands upon the author's viewpoint. In other words, is resorting to social media a healthy option or a sign of trouble to come? The answer depends on the nature of people's social circles and the access to these social circles. For instance, so then at this point you would explain what those social circles look like, how they differ, and how access factors in. Now let's take a look at the exact same paragraph again, but in this paragraph the student writer disagrees with the author. With this question, Marsha only presents two alternatives, oversimplifying social media use. If instead of a dialogue between you and that one source, that you were actually having a conversation with two or more sources, so again, two or more authors, this would be the type of synthesis you would be expected to do for 99% of college papers or projects. It would look something like this. In blue is one author, in red the student writer, and in purple is the second author's perspective. Let me read the red and purple. Marshy never answers his own question, but he suggests that Facebook could be alienating people from meaningful face-to-face social relationships, the kind of relationships that overlook the health and well-being of those in the relationship. Marcus Dorado, the author of Social Media and the Arts, agrees that social media sites like Facebook cannot replace face-to-face relationships. In the arts, he explains, it is essential for followers to interact with artists as a way to maintain an ongoing dialogue, because then it becomes more likely that followers participate in the artistic process. In effect, followers will attend exhibits, purchase art, or recommend artists to their social circles. Now, if you wanted to disagree, it could sound something like this. With this question, Marshy only presents two alternatives, oversimplifying social media use. And then again, you explain how he oversimplified it. According to artist Marcus Dorado, the author of Social Media and the Arts, another plausible explanation for why Yvette Vickers lay dead for nearly a year undetected was because she was in her 80s. Her story has more to do with the elderly in America than social media use. In fact, Dorado claims that Victor was probably more happy in her final hours connecting with distant fans online than the abandoned elderly who stare down sterile hallways in their wheelchairs in convalescent homes. When synthesizing sources, you need to consider the following. First, think about the stage time you want to give each source. When you're summarizing a source, it's in the spotlight, so how long should it be in the spotlight? Why is it in the spotlight? How does it connect to other pieces of evidence and information in your paper or project? You want to think about your target audience and what the audience needs to know about the source, what the audience values when writers integrate sources into their writing, and what the audience will think about the currency, relevance, authority, accuracy, and purpose of that source. Think about your purpose and goals with using that source. Is it to provide breadth to illustrate that you're familiar with the literature in your field? Or is it to persuade your audience? When synthesizing sources, you need to determine your stance or position. In other words, imagine if you were at a UN discussion on global warming and you just heard a spectrum of views on humans' role in the problem. What seat would you take? And then you want to think about the genre, which can shape the way you use your sources. For instance, a literature review is going to have an in-depth synthesis of dozens of sources, whereas a newspaper article would have fewer than 12 sources, and a college essay tends to have about 6 to 10 sources. In sum, when thinking about synthesis, you need to think about the rhetorical situation. And last, I want to conclude this video by talking about a strategy that will help you organize your synthesis early on in the process. I always start by grouping my source summaries. You can print them out and lay them on a table. I first ask myself, what ideas do they share? I write down in one circle those ideas. The ideas may be the same or they may complement each other. I then ask, in what ways are their ideas different? What are the opposing views? On the table that I'm working with, then I place the sources on sort of separate ends of the table. I then ask whether the sources are from the same discipline. Some audiences will look down upon research that is all over the place. When students do research, they rarely investigate into the writer's disciplinary background. This is important because it determines the writer's methodologies, theories, and value system. For instance, does the writer believe in computer analysis to make sense of the world, or does the writer value in-depth interviews? If you're writing a paper that relies on computer analysis for computer scientists, and you include an interview about a user's feelings, then that audience may discredit you as an authority because you use a type of evidence they don't value. And once again, how you group these sources depends on the rhetorical situation. Alright, so let's quickly review. First, synthesis is a mashup of ideas and perspectives. It establishes connections between sources, allows you to create inferences from sources and develop your own ideas. You want to imagine that you're the fourth person joining this conversation. Use the they say, I say sentence frame to organize your synthesis, as well as group your sources. And all in all, don't forget to consider the rhetorical situation when synthesizing sources. This concludes this video lesson on strategies for synthesis. Check out my other videos on online research and writing in APA format by visiting mlourdes1013 on YouTube.